Hello, I'm Stephen Cole, and welcome to Season 2 of the Answers Project podcast from CGTN Europe, where we try to find the answers, or at least make sense of, some of the trickiest questions facing us in this increasingly complicated world. We've got access to some of the best brains on the planet to see if they can help shed light on some of the most pressing ethical, scientific, geopolitical, and philosophical quandaries. And I'm joined by wonderful Mari Beveridge, who's going to help me unravel this week's question. Mari, what are we asking this week?
This week, Stephen, we are asking, can we ever beat poverty?
As ever on the Answers Project, we only address the big issues. It's a huge question. I imagine the answer is not going to be simple. And why did you choose this question?
A couple of reasons. We've been talking about poverty for a long time, and it still hasn't been resolved. And it feels like that there should be a way that we can resolve it. But also, the last 2 years of the pandemic have really undone a lot of the progress on poverty alleviation. So I think it's a particularly pertinent time to talk about it.
OK, so where to start? And as in the best podcast, we need to define our terms. What is poverty?
So the World Bank organization is really the sort of authority on this, and they describe poverty as hunger. Poverty is a lack of shelter. Poverty is being sick and not being able to see a doctor. Poverty is not having access to school and not knowing how to read. Poverty is not having a job, is fear for the future, is living one day at a time.
So that's the definition using qualitative data. What about quantitative? Can poverty be measured?
Again, according to the World Bank, anyone who is living on less than $1.90 a day is living in extreme poverty. And anyone who's unable to afford basic food, clothing, healthcare, shelter, and that currently is 689 million people. As a percentage, that is 9.2% of the global population.
So almost 10% of the people living in the world are classified as living in extreme poverty. It's a huge number. Do we have any details on the demographics? Who are the people behind the numbers?
So children actually account for 2/3 of the world's poor, and women represent a majority in most regions, but we'll come to gender parity a bit later on.
And geographically, which regions are suffering the most?
In recent years, extreme poverty has become increasingly concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. About 40% of the region's people live on less than $1.90 a day. And in the Middle East and Northern Africa, extreme poverty rates nearly doubled between 2015 and 2018, from 3.8% to 7.2%.
And I presume that's the result of the crises, the wars in Syria and Yemen.
Yeah, spot on. And unfortunately, since 2019, these numbers have got much, much worse as a result of another enormous issue that I mentioned earlier, the COVID-19 pandemic. It has had a catastrophic impact on global poverty alleviation efforts.
So how far has the pandemic taken us back?
Well, to explain its impact, I want to go to our first guest, Achim Steiner, the administrator of the United Nations Development Programme.
Well, I think in a generic and global sense, you can say without any hesitation that it is a major setback. Depending on where you live and what country you belong to and what kind of social protection systems were able to be mobilized, the impact on poverty has been differential. Now, clearly in the low-income countries across the world, where very little social protection exists, we have seen massive increase in poverty, also in extreme poverty. The numbers going well beyond 100 million people who have already been thrown back into poverty. In Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, UNDP recently published a new human development report for the region, and we estimate that the setback has really taken us back 13 years to the year 2008, when we last saw these kinds of poverty levels.
Well, that's very bad news. 13 years of progress undone by the pandemic.
Yeah, it's really, really shocking. And according to the World Bank report on projected poverty impacts of COVID-19, between 71 to 100 million people are being pushed into poverty just as a result of this crisis, with the majority of the new extreme poor being found in South Asian and sub-Saharan countries, where poverty rates are already really, really high. In 2021, over 143 million people slipped further into poverty.
And is that on top of or including the amount of people already living in poverty?
So this is in addition to. So these new poor will join the 1.3 billion people already living in some form of poverty who saw their pre-existing deprivations made worse during the pandemic.
And in terms of protecting and helping the world's poor during this global crisis, how did we do on that?
Well, here's Achim Steiner again.
You know, historians will one day judge how badly or how well the world came together around COVID-19. I think we have to be fairly honest that in the first 6 to 12 months, and I think to many this is also understandable, I think the early experience of COVID-19 will not be remembered as one of the great moments where the world acted rationally and with wisdom, but rather in reflex, under pressure, and obviously to some extent even in panic mode.
The impact of COVID-19 has been the hardest on people who, for generations, have lacked equal access to public goods and services, quality healthcare systems, and strong social protection. So it makes it harder to cope with any shocks.
And that multi-generational poverty is known as the cycle of poverty. Is that right?
Yeah, so poverty is often described as a trap. For someone to get out of poverty, they need opportunities like education, they need clean water, medical facilities, and financial resources. And without these basic elements, poverty becomes a cycle, as you say, from one generation to the next.
Well, that makes sense. If families are too poor to send their children to school, their children will have a very difficult time trying to earn an income when they grow up. And if a community lacks clean water, women will spend their day gathering water instead of working, instead of bringing in money. If medical facilities are far away, a parent loses income every time they take a sick child to the doctor.
Absolutely. It all has a sort of knock-on effect.
I'm bringing all those factors back into the issue of COVID. I imagine the measures imposed to limit the spread of the pandemic have pushed the poor further, deeper into poverty. The informal economy, which enables many people in poverty to survive, was, I suppose, virtually shut down in many countries for months.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. On this, I want to go to another guest who I spoke to about jobs in relation to poverty. His name is Guy Ryder. He's the Director General of the International Labour Organization. And he oversaw a report that was released in 2021, which looked at how the recovery process is likely to go throughout 2022.
Well, 2020 was the biggest crisis in the world of work in modern times. To give you some sort of comparison, the impact on jobs and incomes was about 4 times greater than in the financial crisis of 2008-2009. Looked at that way, we're digging ourselves out of quite a deep hole, I'm afraid. And what the report we're launching today looks at is how the recovery process is likely to go. And looking forward from here to the end of next year, the end of 2022, I think the message is that the recovery, though important, will be incomplete. We won't be back to where we started from. But perhaps even more important than that is the unevenness of this recovery. Some are going to do quite well, others are going to have a very hard time of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. He mentioned the inequality and unevenness of the recovery. So who's pulling the short straw?
Well, it's women in particular who have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. You may or may not be surprised to hear that women have lost their jobs in significantly larger numbers than men.
Right. Why is that? Or how come?
Well, here is Guy Ryder again to explain.
Firstly, because they are segregated and concentrated in those sectors which have been hardest hit. Secondly, because often they're on relatively insecure employment contracts, so it's easier for them to be shown the door in the first instance. And thirdly, as you've indicated, they've had to pick up those care responsibilities at home. When schools close, when the kids need looking after, women invariably pick it up. And what is worrying, I think, in particular, is that 9 out of every 10 women who have moved out of their jobs during the pandemic have actually left the labour force. They're not unemployed, they're inactive, as the economists would say. They're simply not participating anymore. So the question becomes, how and will these people come back, these women come back into the labour force?
Mari, what our experts seem most frustrated about is that the world was doing relatively well on alleviating poverty before COVID, wasn't it?
That's right. Absolute poverty rates had fallen faster in the past 30 years than in any other time on record. And the impressive fall was actually the result of changes in just two countries, China and India. China in particular has done a pretty impressive job with this.
That's right. China's President Xi Jinping announced last year that China had met a long-awaited target of lifting the entire country out of extreme poverty by 2021.
Yeah. According to the World Bank, China has brought over 800 million people out of extreme poverty since launching economic reforms in the 70s. The national benchmark used by the Chinese government is slightly higher than the $1.90 a day poverty line used by the World Bank to look at poverty globally. For some insight on how it's calculated in China, I spoke to journalist Luo Liming, a reporter from China Radio International, about how the poverty line is calculated there.
So the definition of the current poverty line, so that was set in 2011 and is 2,300 yuan in annual disposable income per capita, which is roughly $1 a day, and it looks like a rather modest goal. But 10 years later now, that 2,300 yuan is worth 4,000 yuan at the current price level, and we've already shot through that target. The per capita disposable income of the rural poor increased from 6,079 yuan in 2013 to 12,588 yuan, or nearly $2,000 in 2020.
So those are the numbers. I hope you had your calculator out, Stephen. What I found really interesting when chatting with Liming was his personal perspective and how he had seen the face of poverty transform in his lifetime in China.
My hometown has been transformed in the sense that previously it was a small basin tucked away in the mountains, and it was remote and we didn't have a lot of interaction. The first time I got on a train was the age of 17 actually, when I had to leave the town and travel to Shanghai to study in the university. And I remember the markets, the fairs, actually, the farmers' markets, if you travel there, it's always stinky, and the commodities, especially the bananas, they were black, they were not fresh. And then in recent years, when I had a chance to travel back home, I was glad to find out that people were using smartphones and we could spend money on fresh vegetables. And vegetables were sort of something we take for granted because we were rural and we had fresh vegetables, but fresh fruits, we didn't grow them locally. So to see them displayed at the fruit stands was something that I wasn't familiar with when I was a little boy.
And you're absolutely right, Mari. Seeing the face of poverty, you said, transform in his lifetime, and in such a short amount of time. It must have been incredible for him to see that sort of change in his lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. And Achim Steiner, who we heard from earlier, says China's success with poverty really comes down to two factors.
I think the words priority and choice sum up very well, the story of poverty reduction and eradication in China. Priority was given to addressing not only the modernization and industrialization, which clearly became the economic engine of China's remarkable economic growth and development over the last 30 years, but from very early on, there was a strong commitment to also deal with poverty eradication and to address those who were not living in the shiny new big cities being built in the industries around the urban centers, but also to deal with those living in the rural economy and the rural areas of China. And leaving no one behind is something that has been integral to many of China's development policies. It was given a priority and development choices were made. And so China's record in lifting people out of poverty, literally hundreds of millions of people over just 2 or 3 decades, is without precedent so far.
Yeah, it's certainly without precedent. Certainly without precedent in so short a time. So earlier we heard about the realities and difficulties of extreme poverty. Feels like we've entered the solutions phase of this episode, bringing us back to the exam questions. Can we ever beat poverty? And if yes, how?
So, There are a few key areas to look at when it comes to trying to solve this problem. Tackling hunger, granting access to education, funding innovation, reforming agriculture, creating jobs, management of natural resources, and growth policies. So China and India are really, really good examples that have done well to reduce their extreme poverty numbers through measures just like those.
So other countries could take a leaf out of China or India's book.
If only it was that simple. A lot of Asian countries have had success in tackling poverty through mass migrations of rural workers to big cities to work in big factories. But there just aren't really the same opportunities in parts of sub-Saharan Africa where almost half of the world's poor live.
And why is that?
There's a number of reasons. Even though poverty numbers are dropping, the population has boomed and will continue to. And there is just a lack of infrastructure, a lack of public transport. The transport links aren't great. And there's limited access to essential services.
So what can be done? We've already heard how we can't afford to leave poorer countries behind.
No, and that's exactly what Guy Ryder, who we heard from earlier, was saying. He says that we need to look at the issue of fiscal space. He explained that the 16 trillion US dollars that the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, tells us was spent by governments worldwide to deal with the economic and social fallout of the pandemic, he says it's been spent by rich countries on rich countries. Here he is again.
We really cannot leave the less developed countries to fend for themselves. There have been some modest attempts to suspend debt servicing, but I think we have to be very worried that if the developing world, I use the phrase rather generally, is left to its own devices and debt stress is already increasing, then we're going to get into a bit of a mess here. So I think in terms of issues like special drawing rights at the IMF, we need to take care of the fiscal space in the developing world. Plus, and I think we can consider that health policy today is economic policy. Now, we really cannot tolerate a situation, not just from a moral, but from a self-interested perspective, a situation where, many parts of the world are doing very nicely in developing vaccines and getting them into the arms of their citizens, but, to the exclusion of others.